Hey, fearless friends! Welcome to Terror Tales, a podcast presented by the Tech Think Tank. Get ready, where the darkness awaits. Are you prepared to let it in? Let the haunting begin. Tonight's bone-chilling terror tale, Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen.
Chapter 6. Before Drake had reached his side, his purpose plain upon his stern, rather ascetic features, Dundee had taken a hasty glance at the watch cupped in his palm and noted the exact minute and second of the interruption. "Time out!" "One moment, Mr. Drake," he said calmly. "I quite agree with you from your viewpoint. What mine is, you can't be expected to know. But believe me when I say that I consider it of vital importance to the investigation of the murder of Mrs. Selim that this particular bridge hand, with all its attending remarks, the usual bickering, and its interruptions of arriving guests for cocktails, be played out exactly as it was this afternoon. I thought I had made myself clear before. If you don't wish me to believe that you have something to conceal by refusing to take part in a rather grisly game—" "Certainly I have nothing to conceal," John C. Drake snorted angrily. "Then please bow as gracefully as possible to necessity," Dundee urged without rancor. "And may I ask, before we go on, if you made your entrance at this time, and the facts of your arrival?" Drake considered a moment, gnawing a thin upper lip. Beads of sweat stood on his high, narrow forehead. "I walked over from the country club, after 18 holes of golf with your superior, the district attorney," Drake answered with nasty emphasis. "I left the clubhouse at 5:10, calculating that it would take me about 20 minutes for the walk of about a mile." Dundee made a mental note to find out exactly how far from this lonely house in Primrose Meadows the country club actually was, but his next question was along another line. "You walked, Mr. Drake? After 18 holes of golf on a warm day?" Drake flushed. "My wife had the car. I had driven out with Mr. Sanderson, but he was called away by a long-distance message. I lingered at the club for a while, chatting and, having a cool drink or two, and then I set out afoot." "No one offered you a lift?" Dundee inquired suavely. "No. I presume my fellow members thought I had my car with me, and I asked no one for a lift, for I rather fancied the idea of a walk across the meadows." "I see," said Dundee thoughtfully. "Now, as to your arrival here, I walked in. The door had been left on the latch, as it usually is, when a party is on," Drake explained coldly. "And I was just entering the room when I heard my wife make the remark about covering an honor with an honor, and then her question of Penny as to whether she should have played second-hand low." "So you entered this time at the correct moment," said Dundee. "Now, Mr. Drake, I am going to ask you to re-enter the room and do exactly as you did upon your arrival at approximately 5:33. I am sure you would not willingly hamper me, or my superior, in this investigation." Drake wheeled ungraciously and returned to the doorway, while Dundee again consulted his watch, mentally subtracting the minutes which had been wasted upon this interruption from the time he had marked upon his memory as the moment at which Drake had interfered. But an undercurrent of skepticism nagged at his mind. Why had Drake chosen to walk? And why had it taken him from 5:10 to approximately 5:33 to walk a mile or less? The average walker, and especially one accustomed to playing golf, could have easily covered a mile in 15 minutes, instead of the 23 minutes Drake had admitted to. If it was a mile, was it possible that the banker loved wildflowers? With head up aggressively, Drake was undoubtedly making an effort to throw himself into the role, or perhaps into a role chosen on the spot. "Where is everybody?" he called from the doorway. "Am I early?" "Don't interrupt, please, dear," Carolyn Drake answered, her voice trembling now, where before it must have been sharp and querulous. Silently Drake took his place behind his wife's chair, laying a hand affectionately upon her shoulder. Dundee, watching closely, saw Penny's eyes widen with something like shocked surprise. So Drake was trying to deceive him, counting on the oneness of this group, his closest friends. Karen, obviously flustered too, reached to the dummy for the ace of diamonds, to which Penny played the 3, Karen herself discarding the 10 of clubs, and Mrs. Drake the 5 of diamonds. "You asked no questions, Mr. Drake?" Dundee interpolated. The banker flushed again. Yes, I believe I did. Carolyn, Mrs. Drake, explained that Karen was playing for a little slam in spades, and that she had doubled on principle," he added acidly, a voice which Mrs. Drake must be very well accustomed to, Dundee surmised. "And when I told you that Nita had redoubled it, and looked as if she was going to make it," Carolyn Drake whimpered and shifted her short, stout body in the little bridge chair, "you said, why not tell the truth? You said it was just like me, and I might as well take to tatting at bridge parties." "That was said jokingly, my dear," Drake retorted, with a coldness that tried to be affectionate warmth. "Play bridge," Dundee commanded, sure that the approximate length of the previous dispute had now been taken up, whatever retort Carolyn Drake had made. Then he checked himself, again looking at his watch. "And what did you answer to your husband's little joke, Mrs. Drake?" The woman looked helplessly around the table, her slate-colored eyes reddened with tears, then she plunged recklessly, after a fearful glance at Dundee's implacable face. "I said that if it was Nita he was talking to, he wouldn't speak in that tone, that she could make all the foolish mistakes of overbidding or revoking or doubling that she wanted to, and he wouldn't say a word except to praise her." "Then I might as well confess," Drake said acidly, "that I answered substantially as follows. Nita is an intelligent bridge player as well as a charming woman, my dear. Now make the most of that little family tiff, sir, and be damned to you." "Did that end the scene, Mrs. Drake?" Dundee asked gently. I said something about all the men thinking Nita was perfect," Mrs. Drake confessed, "and I cried a little, but we went on with the hand. And Johnny," Mr. Drake went away, walking up and down the room, waiting for Nita to come back, I suppose. "Then go on with the game," Dundee ordered. Silently now, as silently as the real game must have been played, because of the embarrassing scene between husband and wife, the sinister game was carried to its conclusion. Karen led the jack of hearts from the dummy, Penny played her 7, Karen contributed her own deuce, and Mrs. Drake followed suit with the 5. Again Karen led from the dummy, with the 4 of hearts, followed by Penny's 9, taking it with her own ace, Mrs. Drake throwing off the 5 of clubs. Karen then led the 6 of hearts, Carolyn Drake discarded the 6 of clubs, Dummy took the trick with the 8 of hearts, and Penny sloughed the 3 of clubs. With a faint imitation of the triumph with which she had played the hand the first time, Karen threw down her remaining 3 trumps. "I've made it! A little slam!" She tried to sound very triumphant. "Doubled and redoubled. How much did Nita and I make, Penny?" "Plenty!" But before putting pencil to score pad, Penny cupped her chin in her hands and stared at Carolyn Drake. "I'd like to know, Carolyn, if it isn't one of your most cherished secrets, what possessed you to double in the first place?" Carolyn Drake flushed scarlet as she protested feebly. "I thought, of course, I could take 2 club tricks with my ace and king. That's why I doubled the little slam, of course. And my first double simply meant that I had one good suit. I thought, if you could bid all that my 2 doubletons—" "Oh, what's the use?" Penny groaned. "But may I remind you that it is not bridge to lead from a queen? You led the deuce of diamonds, when of course the play, since you had seen the ace in the dummy, was to lead your queen, forcing the ace and leaving my king guarded to take a trick later." "But Karen didn't have any diamonds at all," Carolyn defended herself. "A secret you weren't in on when you led from your queen," Penny reminded her. "Oh well, we'll pay up and shut up." And she made a pretense of totting up the score, while Karen, who had risen, stood over her like a bird poised for flight. At that instant Dexter Sprague began to advance into the room, Janet Raymond at his side, her face flaming. "Behave exactly as you did before," Dundee commanded in a harsh whisper. "No time for coddling these people now." Dexter Sprague's face took on a yellower tinge, but he obeyed. "Greetings," he called in the jaunty, over-cordial tones of a man who knows himself not too welcome. "Where's Nita and everybody? Isn't that the cocktail shaker I hear?" Having received no answer from anyone present, Sprague strolled through the living room and on into the dining room, Janet following. Judge Marshall had nodded stiffly, and John C. Drake had muttered the semblance of a greeting. Were they all overdoing it a bit, this reacting of their hostility to the sole remaining outsider of their little compact group? Dundee stroked his chin thoughtfully. But Penny was saying in her abrupt, husky voice, "Above the line, 1,250, below the line, 720, making a total of 1,970 on this hand, Karen." "Won't Nita be glad?" Karen gasped, then began to run totteringly, calling, "Nita! Nita!" But in the hall she collapsed, shuddering, crying in a child's whimper, "No, no, I can't go in there again." It was Dundee who reached her first. Dundee, and not her outraged and excited old husband. "Mrs. Marshall, listen, please," he begged in a low voice, as he lifted her so that her head rested against his arm. "You have been splendid, wonderful. Please believe that I am truly sorry to distress you, and that very soon, I hope, you may go home and rest." "I can't bear any more," Karen whimpered. Ignoring Judge Marshall's blustering, Dundee continued softly, "You don't want the wrong person to be accused of this terrible crime, do you, Mrs. Marshall? Of course not. And you do want to help us all you can to discover who really killed Mrs. Selim?" I suppose so," Karen conceded on a sob. "Then I'll help you. I'll go to the bedroom with you," Dundee promised her with a sigh of relief. To the others he spoke sharply. "Go back to the exact positions in living room and dining room and solarium that you occupied when Mrs. Marshall ran from the room." "I think you're overdoing it, Bonnie," Captain Strawn protested. "But sure, I'll see that they mind you." With Karen Marshall clinging to his arm, Dundee walked down the hall, beyond the staircase to an open door on his left, a door guarded by a lounging plainclothesman. Seated at the dressing table of the guest lavatory was Flora Miles, her sallow, dark face so ravaged that she looked 10 years older than when he had first seen her an hour before. "So you were in here when you heard Mrs. Marshall scream, Mrs. Miles?" Dundee paused to ask. "Yes, yes," she gasped, rising. "And that horrible man has made me stay in here. Of course, the door was closed before. I telephoned home to ask about my children, and then I came in here to do my face over." "You didn't hear your husband arrive?" "No, I didn't hear him arrive," Flora Miles faltered, her handkerchief dabbing at her trembling, over-rouged lips. "I see," Dundee said, slowly. He stepped into the little room, leaving Karen to stand weakly against the door-frame. Without a word to Mrs. Miles, he looked closely at the top of the dressing table and into the small waste-basket that stood beside it. You can see that I cold-creamed my face before I put on fresh powder and rouged," Flora Miles pointed out, with an obvious effort at offended dignity. "After I came back, while you were making those poor girls play the hand over again, I went through the same motions, because you told all of us to behave exactly as we had done before." "I see," Dundee agreed. "Pretty clever, in spite of being almost frightened to death," Dundee said to himself. But he had been just a shade cleverer than she, for he had been in this room ahead of her, and there had been no balls of greasy face tissue in the wastebasket then. He was passing out of the room, offering his arm to Karen, when one of his underlined notes thrust itself upon his memory. "May I see your bridge tally, please, Mrs. Miles?" "My bridge tally?" she echoed blankly. "Why, it must be on the table where I was playing." "It is not," Dundee assured her quietly. "Perhaps it is in your handbag?" And he glanced at the rather large raffia bag that lay on the table. She snatched it up, slightly averting her body as she looked hastily through its contents. "It isn't here. Oh, I don't know where it is. What does it matter?" Without replying, Dundee escorted the trembling little discoverer of Nita Selim's body into the large, ornate bedroom, murmuring as he did so, "Don't be frightened, Mrs. Marshall. Mrs. Selim isn't here now, and you shan't have to scream. I'll give the signal myself. I just want you to go through the same motions you did before." On jerky feet, the girl advanced to Nita's now deserted vanity dresser. "I was calling to her all the time," she whispered. "I didn't even wait to knock, and I began to tell her how much we'd made off that hand, when she didn't answer. I didn't touch her, but I saw..." Again she gripped her face with her hands and was about to scream. "I know," Dundee assured her gently. Then he shouted, "Ready!" Herded by Strawn, the small crowd of men and women came running into the room, Judge Marshall leading the way, Penny being second in line. Penny second? Why not Flora Miles, who had been nearer to that room than any of the others, if her story was true? Dundee asked himself. But all had crowded into the room, including Polly Beale and Clive Hammond, before Mrs. Miles crept in. "Is this the order of your arrival?" Dundee asked them all. Penny, who was standing against the wall just inside the doorway, spoke up, staring at Flora with frowning intentness. "You're sort of mixed up, aren't you, Flora? I was standing right here until the worst of it was over. I didn't even go near Nita, and I know you didn't pass me. I remember that Tracy stepped away from the body and called you and you weren't here. And then, almost the next minute, I saw you coming toward him from over there." And Penny pointed toward that corner of the room which held, on one angle, the door leading to the porch, and on its other angle the window from which, or from near which, Nita Selim had been shot. "You're lying, Penny Crane! I did no such thing!" Flora Miles cried hysterically. "I came running in with the rest of you, and I rushed over here just to see if I could see anybody running away across the meadow." "My wife is right, sir," Tracy Miles added his word aggressively. "I saw what she was doing, the most sensible of all of us, and I ran to join her. We looked out of the windows, both on the side windows and the rear ones, and out onto the porch, but we didn't see anything." Surprisingly, Dundee abandoned the point. "And you were the only one to touch her, Sprague?" "I believe so," Dexter Sprague answered in a strained voice. "I laid my hand on her hair for an instant, then I picked up her hand to see if there was any pulse left." "Yes, she was dead." "And her hand, did it feel cold?" "Neither cold nor warm, just cool," Sprague answered in a voice that was nearly strained with emotion. She always had cool hands." "What did you do, Judge Marshall?" Dundee asked abruptly. "I took my poor little wife away from this room, laid her on a couch in the living room, and then telephoned the police. Miss Crane stood at my elbow, urging me to hurry so that she might ring you as she did. Your line was busy, and she lost about 5 minutes before getting you." "And the rest of you?" Dundee asked. "Nothing spectacular, I'm afraid, Mr. Dundee," Polly Beale answered in her brusque, deep voice, now edged with scorn. Further questioning elicited little more, beyond the fact that Clive Hammond had dashed out to circle the house and look over the grounds, and that John Drake had been fully occupied with an hysterical wife. "Better let this bunch go for the present, hadn't we, boy?" Captain Strawn whispered uneasily. "Not a thing on any of them." "Not quite yet, sir, if you don't mind," Dundee answered in a low voice. "Will you take them back into the living room and put them under Sergeant Turner's charge for a while? Then there are 1 or 2 things I'd like to talk over with you." Mollified by the younger man's deference and persuasiveness, Strawn obeyed the suggestion, to return within 5 minutes, his grey brows drawn into a frown. "I hope you'll be willing to take full credit for that fool bridge game, Bonnie," he worried. "I don't want to look like a chump in the newspapers." "I'll take the blame," Dundee assured him, with a grin. "But that fool bridge game, and I admit it was a horrible thing to have to do, told me a whole bunch of facts that ought to be very, very useful." "For instance?" Strawn growled. "For instance," Dundee answered, "it told me that it took approximately 8 minutes to play out a little slam bid, when ordinarily it would have taken not more than 2 or 3 minutes. Not only that, but it told me the names of everyone in this party who could have killed Nita Selim. And, good Lord, of course!" And to Captain Strawn's amazement, Dundee threw open the door of Nita's big clothes closet, jerked on the light, and stooped to the floor. End of Chapter 6.
Hey, if you enjoying the stories, give us a thumbs up by clicking the like button and hit subscribe to our Tech Think Tank channel. To hear more Terror Tales, click the pop-up banner now or follow the link in the description below. Time to get back into our terror tale. Ready for more? Let's continue the story.
Chapter 7. Almost immediately, Special Investigator Dundee rose from his crouching position on the floor of Nita Selim's closet and faced the chief of the homicide squad of Hamilton's police force. "I think," he said, quietly for all the excitement that burned in his blue eyes, "that we'd better have Mrs. Miles in for a few questions." "What have you got there, a dance program?" Strawn asked curiously. But as Dundee continued to stare silently at the thing he held, the older man strode to the door and relayed the order to a plainclothes detective. "I sent for Mrs. Miles," Dundee said coldly, when husband and wife appeared together, Flora's thin, tense shoulders encircled by Tracy's plump arm. "If you're going to badger my wife further, I intend to be present, sir," Miles retorted, thrusting out his chest. "Very well," Dundee conceded curtly. "Mrs. Miles, why didn't you tell me in the first place that you were in this room when Nita Salim was shot?" "Because I wasn't in the room," Flora protested, clinging with both thin, big-banged hands to her husband's arm. "Sir, you have no proof of this absurd accusation, and I shall personally take this matter up." "I have the best of proof," Dundee said quietly, and took his hand from his pocket. "You recognize this, Mrs. Miles? You admit that it is the tally card you used while playing bridge this afternoon?" No, it isn't mine!" Flora cried hysterically, cringing against her husband, who began to protest in a voice falsetto with rage. Dundee ignored his splutterings. "May I point out that it is identical with the other tally cards used at Mrs. Salim's party today, and that on its face it bears your name, Flora?" And he politely extended the card for her inspection. "I guess it must be mine. But I was not in this room when Nita was shot." "But you will admit that you were in her clothes closet at some time during the 20 or more minutes that elapsed between your leaving the bridge game when you became dummy and the moment when Karen Marshall screamed?" As Flora Miles said nothing, staring at him with great terrified black eyes, Dundee went on relentlessly. "Mrs. Miles, when you left the bridge game, you did not intend to telephone your house. You came here, into this room, and you lay in wait, hiding in her closet, until Nita Salim appeared, as you knew she would sooner or later." No, that's a lie! A lie, I tell you!" the woman shrilled at him. "I did telephone my house, and I talked to Junior when the maid put him up to the phone. You can ask her yourself if you don't believe me." "But after you telephoned, you stole into this room." No! I made up my face, all fresh, just as I told you." Dundee did not bother to tell her how well he knew she was lying, for suddenly something knocked on the door of his mind. He strode to the closet, searched for a moment among the multitude of garments hanging there, then emerged with the brown silk summer coat which Nita Salim had worn to break away in that room. Before the terrified woman's eyes, he thrust a hand first into one deep pocket and then another, finding nothing except a handkerchief of fine embroidered linen and a pair of brown suede gauntlet gloves. "Will you let me have the note, please, Mrs. Miles?" The note Nita received during her luncheon party, and which she thrust before your eyes into a pocket of this coat. "It is in your handbag, I am sure, since you have had no opportunity unobserved to destroy it." "What ghastly nonsense is this, Dundee?" Tracy Miles demanded, furious. But Dundee again ignored him. His implacable eyes held Flora Miles's until the woman broke suddenly, piteously. She fumbled in the raffia bag which had been hanging from her arm. "Good God, Flora, what does it all mean?" Tracy Miles collapsed like a pricked pink balloon. "That's my stationery, one of my business envelopes." Flora Miles dropped the bag which she need no longer watch and clutch with terror as she dug her thin fingers into her husband's shoulders and looked down at his puzzled face, for she was a little taller than he. "Forgive me, darling. Oh, I knew God would punish me for being jealous. I thought you were writing love letters to that woman." Dundee did not miss the slightest significance of that scene as he retrieved the blue-gray envelope she had dropped. It was inscribed in a curious handwriting, "Mrs. Salim, private dining room, breakaway inn." "Let's see, boy," Strawn said with respect in his harsh voice. Dundee withdrew the single sheet of business stationery and obligingly held it so that the chief of detectives could read it also. "Nita, my sweet," the note began without dateline. "Forgive your bad boy for last night's row, but I must warn you again to watch your step. You've already gone too far. Of course I love you and understand. But be good, baby, and you won't be sorry. The note was signed Dexy. Dundee tapped the note for a long minute, while Tracy Miles continued to console his wife. A new avenue, he thought. Perhaps a long, long avenue. Mrs. Miles, he began abruptly, and the tear-streaked face turned toward him. You say you thought this letter to Mrs. Selim had been written by your husband? Yes, she gasped. I'm jealous-natured, I admit it, and when I saw one of our own, one of Tracy's business envelopes, you made up your mind to steal it and read it? Yes, I did. A wife has a right to know what her husband's doing if it's anything like that. Her haggard black eyes again implored her husband for forgiveness before she went on. I did slip into Nita's room and go into her closet to see if she had left the letter in her coat pocket. I closed the door on myself, thinking I could find the light cord, but it was caught in one of the dresses or something, and it took me a long time to find it in the dark of the closet, but I did find it at last and was just reading the note. You read it? Even after you saw that the handwriting on the envelope wasn't your husband's? Dundee queried in assumed amazement. Flora's thin body sagged. I thought maybe Tracy had disguised his handwriting. So I read it and saw it was from Dexter. Mr. Miles, do you know how some of your business stationery got into Sprague's hands? He's had plenty of opportunity to filch stationery or almost anything he wants hanging around my offices as he does. An idler. But Dundee was in a hurry. He wheeled from the garrulity of the husband to the tense terror of the wife. Mrs. Miles, I want you to tell me exactly what you know, unless you prefer to consult a lawyer first. Sir, if you are insinuating that my wife... Oh, let me tell him, Tracy. Mrs. Miles capitulated suddenly, completely. I was in the closet when Nita was killed, I suppose, but I didn't know she was being killed, because I was lying in there on the closet floor in a dead faint. Dundee stared at the woman incredulously, then suppressed a groan of almost unbearable disappointment. If Flora Miles was telling the truth, here went a-flying his only eyewitness, probably, or rather his only ear witness. Just when did you faint, Mrs. Miles? He asked, struggling for patience. Before or after Nita came into this room? I was just finishing the note with the light on in the closet and the door shut when I heard Nita come into the room. I knew it was Nita because she was singing one of those Broadway songs she was so crazy about. I jerked off the light and crouched way back in a corner of the closet. A velvet evening wrap fell down over my head and I was nearly smothering, but I was afraid to try to dislodge it for fear a hanger would fall to the floor and make an awful clatter. And then... She shuddered and clung to her husband. What caused you to faint, Mrs. Miles? Sir, my wife has heart trouble. What did you hear, Mrs. Miles? Dundee persisted. I couldn't hear very well, all tangled up in the coat and way back in the closet, but I did hear a kind of bang or a bump. No, not a pistol shot. And because it came from so near me, I thought it was Nita or Lydia coming to get something out of the closet and I'd be discovered, so I fainted. She drew a deep breath and went on. When I came to, I heard Karen scream and then people running in. But all the time that awful tune was going on and on. Tune? Dundee gasped. Do you mean Nita Selim's song? Flora Miles seemed to be dazed by Dundee's vehement question. Why, yes, Nita's own tune. That's what she called it, her own tune. But Mrs. Miles, Dundee protested, ashamed that his scalp was prickling with horror. Do you mean to tell me that Nita was not dead then? When Karen Marshall screamed? Dead? Flora repeated, more bewildered. Of course she was. Or at least they all said so. Oh, I know what you mean. And you don't mean what I mean at all. Steady, honey girl, Tracy Miles urged, putting his arm about his wife. I'd better tell you, Dundee. When we all came running into the room, there was Nita's powder box playing its tune over and over. Oh, Dundee wiped his forehead. You mean it's a musical box? Yes, and plays when the lid is off, Tracy answered, obviously delighted to have the limelight again. Well, of course, since Nita couldn't put the lid back on, it was still playing. What was the tune, honey? He asked his wife tenderly. I haven't much ear for music at best, but at a time like that... It was playing Juanita, Flora answered wearily, over and over. Nita, Juanita, be my own fair bride, she quavered obligingly. Only not the words, of course, just the tune. That's why Nita bought the box, I suppose, because it played her namesake song. Maybe one of her beaux gave it to her, Tracy suggested lightly, patting his wife's trembling shoulder. Anyway, Dundee, the thing ran on until it ran down, I suppose. I confess I wanted to put the lid back on to stop the damn thing, but Hugo said we mustn't touch anything. And quite right, Dundee cut in. Now, Mrs. Miles, about that noise you heard. Did you hear anyone enter the room? No? Well then, did you hear Nita speak to anyone? You said you thought it might be Lydia coming to get something out of the closet. I didn't hear Nita speak a word to anybody, though she might have, and I wouldn't have heard, all muffled up in that velvet evening wrap and so far back in the closet. Did you hear the door onto the porch? It's quite near the closet. The door was open when we came in, Dundee, Tracy interposed. It must have been open all the time. I didn't hear it open, Mrs. Miles confirmed him wearily. I tell you, I didn't hear anything except Nita's coming in singing, then the powder box playing its tune, and that banger bump I told you about. Just where was that? Dundee persisted. I don't know, she shrilled, hysteria rising in her voice again. I told you it sounded fairly near the closet, as if somebody bumped into something. That's what it was like. That's exactly what it was like. And I was so frightened of being found in the closet that I fainted and didn't come to until Karen screamed. She was babbling on, but Dundee was thinking hard. A very convenient feint, that. For the murderer, at least. But why not for Mrs. Miles herself? Odd that she should faint. Why hadn't she trumped up some excuse immediately and left the closet as Nita was entering the room? Was it possibly because she could think of nothing but the great relief of finding that it was Sprague, not her husband, who had been writing love letters to Nita Selim? Jealous woman. Miles, he began abruptly, I think you better tell me how your wife became so jealous of you and Nita Selim that she could get herself into such a false position. Tracy Miles reddened, but a gesture of one of his sunburned hands restrained his wife's passionate defense of him. It's the truth that Flora is jealous-natured, and I suppose, he faltered a moment and his eyes did not meet his wife's, that I like seeing her a little bit jealous of her old man. Sort of makes a man feel, big, pretty important to somebody. So you were just having a bit of fun with your wife so far as Mrs. Selim was concerned? Dundee asked coldly. The blood flowed through the thinning blonde hair. Well, not exactly, he admitted frankly. You see, I did take a shine to Nita, and if I do say so myself, she liked me a lot. Oh, nothing serious. Just a little flirtation like most of our crowd have with each other. Mrs. Miles, Dundee interrupted with sudden harshness. Are you sure you did not know that letter was from Dexter Sprague before you looked for it? Sir, if you are insinuating that my wife carried on a flirtation or an affair with that Sprague insect, Tracy began to bluster. But Dundee's eyes were on Flora Miles, and he saw that her sallow skin had tightened like grayish silk over her thin cheekbones, and that her eyes looked suddenly dead and glassy. You fainted, you say, Mrs. Miles, Dundee went on inexorably. Was it because, by any chance, this note, and he tapped the sheet which had caused so much trouble, revealed the fact that Nita Selim and Dexter Sprague were sweethearts or lovers? It was a battle between those two now. Both ignored Tracy's red-faced rage. Flora licked her dry lips. No, she whispered. No! It was because I was jealous of Tracy and Nita. Yes, and I'd given her cause to be jealous too. Tracy forced himself into the conversation. One night at the country club, Flora saw me and Nita stroll off the porch and down onto the grounds, and she had a right to be sore at me when I got back because I'd cut a dance with her, my own wife. And it was only this very morning that I made a point of driving out of my way, too, by this house to see Nita. Not that I meant any harm, but I was being a little silly about her, and she was about me, too. Not that I'd leave my wife and babies for any Broadway beauty under the sun. Oh, Tracy, and you weren't going to tell me? Was there real jealousy now, or just pretense on Flora's part? You understand, don't you, Dundee? Tracy demanded, man to man. I was just having a little fun on the side. Nothing serious, mind you. But of course I don't tell Flora every little thing. No man does. There have been other girls, other women. Tracy isn't worse than the other men, Flora flamed up. He's such a darling that all the girls pet him and spoil him. Dundee could stand no more of Miles's complacent acceptance of his own rakishness, and certainly a girl like Nita Selim would have been able to bear precious little of it. Conceited ass. But Flora Miles was another matter, and so was Dexter Sprague. You can join me in the living room if you like, Dundee said shortly as he wheeled and strode toward the door. Was that quick, passionate kiss between husband and wife being staged for his benefit? Pretty near through, boy? Strawn, who had been silent and bewildered for a long time, asked anxiously as the two detectives passed into the hall. Not quite. I've got to know several things yet, Dundee answered absently. But in the living room, his mind was wholly upon the business in hand. I'll keep you all no longer than is absolutely necessary, he began, and again the close-knit group, in which only Dexter Sprague was an alien, grew taut with suspense. From the playing out of the death hand at bridge, he went on, using the objectionable phrase again very deliberately, I found that no two of you men arrived together. Mr. Hammond, you were the first to arrive, I believe. It seems that I was, Clive Hammond answered curtly. And yet you did not enter the living room to greet your hostess? I wanted a private word with Polly, Miss Beale, my fiancée, Hammond explained briefly. How and when did you arrive? I don't know the exact time. Never thought of looking at my watch, Hammond offered. I came out in my own roadster, that tan Stutz you may have noticed in the driveway. As for how I entered the house, I leaped upon the porch and opened the door of the solarium. I walked across the solarium, saw Polly just finishing with bridge for the afternoon, and beckoned to her. She joined me in the solarium, and we stayed there until Karen screamed. That's all. Have you been engaged long, Mr. Hammond, you and Miss Beale? Dundee asked as if quite casually. Nearly a year, if it's any of your business, Dundee. And just when had you seen Miss Beale last? Before late this afternoon, Dundee asked. I refuse to answer, Hammond flared. That, at least, is none of your damned business. I believe I can answer my own question, Mr. Hammond, Dundee said very softly.
Thanks for tuning in. If you liked the Terror Tales and got a bit scared, please give the video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And hey, don't forget to subscribe to our Tech Think Tank channel. Your support helps us find more mysterious stories to share. We shall see you in our next episode of Terror Tales. Until then, may your night be wrapped in shadows and touched by the unknown.